We're going to be in Revelations 2. We're going to be 13 through 15. You don't have to stand. We'll make some notes if you want to. That way we can just till right on through this. Amen. So when you are there, say amen. Amen. All right. Majority of you, I think. Said, I know thy works and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is. And thou holdest even where and thou holdest fast my name, and hast not denied my faith, even in those days wherein Amphithus was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you where Satan dwelleth. But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them that holdeth the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornications. So hast thou also, that them that holdeth the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which things I hate. So go ahead and be reseated now. You know what I wanted to draw out and bring out? Thank you. Here is that we're talking about Pergamos, and Pergamos was the crown jewel of Asia Minor for the Roman Empire. And so we're going to be kind of like we did on the city of Ephesus when we started getting into it. I'm just going to be teaching over a lot of history and a lot of facts that is built into Pergamos. And so Pergamos was the crown jewel of the Roman Empire of Asia Minor. Pergamos was deeded over through the last king that lived there. When he died, he did not have no heirs, so he just deeded it over to the Roman Empire. He had made an alliance with them already, and so when he passed away, he died, he gave them to the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was, they loved the city. Pergamos was about 16 miles, it was positioned about 16 miles for the Aegean Sea. And it was about on the top of the hill, which had 1,000-foot elevation from sea level, for it rose just almost nearly just straight up 1,000 feet back out of the sea. And it was Pergamos was on the top of the hill. Pergamos had a population of about 200,000. Now, that was a lot less than Ephesus, because if you'll remember, the city of Ephesus had well over 300,000 people in its city in the ancient days. And so Pergamos wasn't as big as the city of Ephesus, but that didn't take away its splendor. Its theater that was there held about 10,000, which the theater in the city of Ephesus held about 35,000. So, you know, you kind of get a comparison here that Pergamos wasn't near the size of what Ephesus was. But the city of Ephesus was right on the Mediterranean Sea, and it was a commercial trade point. Pergamos, on the other hand, was a place of wealth and prestige. Because everybody in the valleys in the lower lying areas either were merchants, that means they owned businesses, or that they were farmers, agriculturals. They grew something, they raised something, so they couldn't live on top of a mountain. But if you had the wealth of an empire behind you, you had the money to where you can have palaces upon palaces up to where you didn't have to worry about making a living. And then from up at Pergamus, you could just about see the Mediterranean Sea, the Aegean Sea, in about any direction up there from any view. So every house was positioned with that ocean view up there. So if you were anybody that had money, that knew anybody, you lived in Pergamos. And so that was the kind of place that it was. So it was known for its wealth, its art, its culture. It was known for its library there. Because if you remember, now here was the thing that I thought was the most interesting. Ephesus had the third largest library in the ancient world. Only second and first was above it was Pergamos. Pergamos had the second largest library in the world, second to only the Library of Alexandria in Alexandria, Egypt, in the ancient world. In the second largest library there was over 200,000 volumes. And volumes is what they call books at that time. And they were all made out of parchment. Now, parchment was the art where in the city of Pergama, in that area, is where they come up and they developed parchment. Parchment was where that they invented by taking animal skins and they tanned it out until they they cut it very thin, and they dried it out to where it was very, very thin and see-through and very limber, and they used it as paper. And it was very durable. It was a very durable type paper, and that's where parchment paper come from. In the ancient, and you look up parchment in the Webster Dictionary, and the word says there, in ancient world and writings, it was what they wrote on, and it was a very durable form of writing. So, when Mark Antony, anybody know who Mark Antony is, and Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar, all right, so in this era, because this was in about 40 BC. It was in 40 BC, so this was before Christ. And it's when that era, when Julius Caesar, when Mark Antony, when Cleopatra, all of them lived. And so after 44 BC is when the Julius Caesar was murdered and was assassinated, and Mark Antony and Octavia and all of the other generals come into power of the Roman Empire. By this time, they already had control of Pergama. It was part of their empire. And when Mark Antony visited as a royal supreme to Pergama, and he went into the library and he seen this, knowing Cleopatra in the Library of Alexandria and what it was like, he gifted all of the library, the 200,000 scrolls of parchment, because he was so impressed with the technology of parchment, to Cleopatra. And it made a horrendous rift within the Roman Empire. And so, if you know the story, they started warring against each other. Octavia chased Mark Antony's military force down because they split the empire. He chased him down. He defeated him. Mark Antony escaped, went to Egypt, got Cleopatra, and they both committed suicide because they were coming to capture them and to kill them anyway. And all over a library. So you know that it was a pretty important library, because part of that, the other thing, excuse me, that Pergamos was also known for was the 4 major temples that was seated there. Now they had hundreds of temples around Pergama, but there was 4 major ones. And so Dionysus, which was their goddess of grapes and wine, which he was also the goddess of the dead, or the god of the dead. And so the Romans believed that in their beliefs, that if they sacrificed blood to him, that they could speak to the dead. And so he was a pretty important temple that they had in their culture. Athena was another, it was a goddess there, a goddess of war. So they would sacrifice and they would worship the god of Athena the goddess of Athena, because she was the one that would bring the victory to the Romans to continue to conquer. So that was an important one. So it was important to the Romans that if they thought that if they was going to do this thing, they needed to be able to speak to the dead and they needed to be able to win battles. And so that was there. And then there was Exepius. I think that's how you say that, Exepius. And he was the goddess of medicine. And so at the temple there of Exepius was where that there was the first known medical college there at that temple. And what they would do at that temple, and Exepius, what I thought was interesting, in Greek mythology, his daughter was Hygiena, which meant health. That's where we get our English word for hygiene. And so, anyway, at the temple there of Exepius, what they would do is when they would practice their medicine, which part of it would be medicine and stuff, but a lot of it was demon exchange. And was basically, if you wanted to know, if you had something that was bad in you, you would make a mold of it out of clay, that part out of clay, and then you would take that to the temple as an offering, and then you would basically trade one sickness for another. And stuff like that. But people's limbs were healed, their eyes were healed. They, things like that would miraculously happen. But it wasn't a godless, or it wasn't a God miraculous thing. It was a demonic miraculous thing. And so they were having signs and wonders happening in his temple. And so it was a very demonic place where this were happening. But out of all of that, the other temple that was there was the altar of Zeus. Now, to just give you a background, Zeus, there is several things and several words that we've known Satan by. Now, how many know that when Baal, the god of Baal, that was actually Satan they were worshiping? Satan himself. So back in the Old Testaments, when they were doing Baal worship and they were doing Baal sacrifices, and you had the Amaleks and people like that were sacrificing their babies and burning their children for offerings, that was to Baal. That was to Satan. And so, and Baal actually is the name of Baal there in that Arabic language. I think it means the god of the flies, or the god of the little flies. I mean, who wanted to sacrifice children to a god of flies anyway? I mean, we swat them over here, right? How crazy is that? But anyway, nevertheless, it was what they believed, and that's what they done. But it was demonic worship. They were worshiping Satan and doing human sacrifices to Satan. So Zeus is the other form of Baal. Satan, he just would take on different names of whoever would willing to worship and make a blood sacrifice. And so Sunday morning I told you that here that we read, and it says, where Satan dwelleth. And then it says, at Satan's seat. Well, I mean, what he was saying was the altar of Zeus is what that Jesus was talking about. He's talking about the altar of Zeus. And Greek mythology and a lot of the Greek historians and stuff would even note that they believed that they could see Zeus himself come and sit on the throne when they would make appeasing sacrifices to him. Well, it wasn't Zeus that was coming and sitting on that throne. It was Satan manifesting his presence before them. And so then they would continue to sacrifice and do these things. Another name for, we'll just get on to just talk about Zeus for a little bit, was Zeus was the god of the sky and the ruler of the Olympian gods. Another name for him was Jupiter. Jupiter was the god of war in the Roman mythology, and the king planet. Which I had a revelation, because how many of you know that back in September the 23rd, that when the alignment of Virgo and all the other planets and Jupiter passed through the womb. Jupiter is another name for Satan. Passed through the womb through the birth canal. So everybody was looking for Jesus to come back, and they thought that was the Son of God that's passing through the birth canal, coming back, and it could have been something totally different. And so, because I'm fixing to get into this a little bit deeper, and which you may think is a little more interesting. So there was sacrifices that were made to Zeus, that god, to keep peace and balance within the weather and upon the earth and in the area. And if they felt like that Zeus was happy and they done pleasing to him with the sacrifices, everything was well. If catastrophic events or bad weather happened, then that they would amp up their sacrifices because they felt like that Zeus was unhappy. And there was two types of sacrifices. There was blood sacrifices and there was bloodless sacrifices. Blood sacrifices were ox, goats, sheep, pigs, and later humans. Bloodless sacrifices were wheat, rice, bread, oil, incense, and wine. Bloodless sacrifices were meant for home, so you could do this in your home. Home, work, place of business, school, or when you was traveling. They even had burnt offerings and altars on ships to where that they could make their sacrifices on ships when they were traveling to their pagan gods. And blood sacrifices were a community event. Blood sacrifices were only done as a community event. When everybody was there, it was a big celebration. And if you want more information on that, you can look it up yourself, because it gets pretty gruesome of how that they would do these things. And it would just, when I was reading these things and studying this out, of how that they would hold animals down and keep them alive, and they would rip their innards out, and they would try to read it, and they would worship this animal as its guts were hanging out and stuff, and then after a while they would finally kill it and make sacrifices. But they'd done a lot more gruesome things to them than that in the name of worshiping their God. But anyway, and then they would take all of that and they would put it on the altar and they would burn it there. And it would all be a huge community event, and very celebrated for days for doing these things. That's why that Jesus said, "I see you in the midst of Satan's seat where he dwelleth and lives," is because all of this activity was happening right where the church of Pergamos was planted. Out of all the places that all the churches were planted around, Pergamos was one of the darkest and most demonic places that the church planted and started to grow and prosper. Now, in about 92 AD, we have to remember that John the Revelator was still alive at 92 AD. In 92 AD, I think John, it's recorded that somewhere around 99 to 105 AD is when that John finally died and passed away. So somewhere around 92 AD is this event that Jesus is referring to. So John the Revelator is writing this where it says here, where my faithful martyr Antipas, where he was martyred. See, now I know that John would have remembered this because it wouldn't have been too many years past. But here's the other part of this. is the most important thing is that Jesus seen it and remembered it. Now, Antipas, there is not very much information in him. And if you look at him in the Christian form part of this, and you try to find something about him, you find very little other than he was the first Christian martyr of Pergamos. You will also, then if you start getting into some of the historians and you start getting in and digging into some areas, you can start finding a little bit more basically how they martyred him. And what I thought was very interesting was Antipas was the first Christian martyr that was martyred at the altar of Zeus. So he was the first Christian martyr to be martyred at the altar of Zeus. And how that he was martyred was they had a brass cow up by the altar. And in that brass cow, they had a gate in the back of it where they opened it up and they put him inside of that cow, that brass cow, and then they burnt him alive and made him a burnt offering, a live burnt offering at the altar at Zeus. It was recorded and said that they thought that Zeus was very well pleased with this event, which it became a practice that continued on for nearly another 50 to 60 years there in Pergamum, making burnt offerings to Zeus with human Christians. And this carried on until nearly the 2nd century. And then I started wondering what happened to Pergamos. Well, towards the first end of the 1st century, going into the 2nd century, it started to experience earthquakes after earthquakes. It started experiencing torrential rain. Remember how I told you how the harbor there at Ephesus suddenly just silted up and it dried up the city of Ephesus, and they no longer could do business. They no longer could bring in supplies to make sacrifices and to worship the god of Artemis or Diana. And so the same was with Pergamos. All the rains, earthquakes, the earthquakes tore down the temples, the rains, the mudslides, seeing how it was on there, everything was built on a hill, was washing and slipping away, and it started to fall into ruin just shortly after the 2nd century had come. And I started to think about this in two ways. Because as we was talking about with the city of Ephesus, Jesus said, if you do not repent, I'm going to come quickly and pull your candlestick away from you. Well, see, this is the same thing that he tells Pergamos. He said, if you don't repent for everything that you're doing, I'm going to come and take away my candlestick. I'm going to come and take away my church. I'm going to come and take away my spirit away from that area of where that I'm at. And then we see that that's the same thing that happened to Ephesus as what happened to Pergamos. Now, what I thought was very unique was in between Ephesus and Pergamos is Smyrna right here. And Smyrna survived all the earthquakes. It survived all of the rains, all of the floods, all the weather. And today, Smyrna is still the only church that exists from the ancient world. So, but Smyrna was the only church that Jesus did not find anything wrong with. So, we get back here to Pergamos. We get back here to Pergamos and we start talking about Pergamos and then the altar there at Zeus. And I want to just bring out something that I thought was very interesting. Carl Human, has anybody ever heard of Carl Human? Karl Humann in 1864 worked with the Turkish government to do archaeology. He discovered the altar of Zeus in 1878, excavated it to 1886. And by 1889, he had every bit of the altar of Zeus uncovered, categorized, thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of it, and shipped back to Berlin to be reconstructed. The reconstruction of the altar of Zeus started in 1898 in the city of Berlin. At that very moment, there is someone that we know in history that was born. Adolf Hitler was born on the day that they started constructing the altar of Zeus in Berlin. So, if that is not strange enough, when Adolf Hitler in 1932, when he come into power, he wanted a grand backdrop for him. He wanted a grand podium, a grand place to be able to stand and bring all of the Nazi of Germany there before him and to give his speeches there. His Nuremberg speeches. And what he done was he hired Albert Speers as his architect. Albert Speers, at this time, the altar of Zeus was finally reconstructed and the museum was open. And he stood in there at the altar of Zeus and he looked at this and he come up with the idea. And the Zebulon Tribune, I think that's what it was, is where that Hitler would stand and make his grand speeches to all of Nazi Germany there, was configured and adopted after the altar of Zeus. Hitler wanted to stand, but where the golden calf was, where they put Antipas in to make the burnt sacrifice, was where that Hitler would stood in that place to give his speeches. And so that Hitler wanted to be seen as a god. He even took words out of the Bible. And he was said, and in his speech he said, I am flesh of your flesh and bone of your bone. Who said that? And he turned and he convinced the people. And when they would watch, and I was watching films of him, and the people would almost watch with like almost a starstruckness. Almost like that. And he would purposely come and he would wait for the weather to be just right so where his plane would come out of the clouds and he would enter into the people. And everybody would just almost be demonically hypnotized around him. And then he would give these speeches. And then the final speech that he gave over the Jews, saying that if nothing else could be done with them, that it would be pushed to their ultimate polymer to be taken care of. Now, I don't know if you realize this, that when Germany made its final decree to take care of the Jews as their problem, they said they had become unruly and nuisance to everyone. Now, this was speech after speech after speech that has given to the people. Now, when he called for a Holocaust, does anybody know what the word Holocaust means in Greek? The word Holocaust in Greek means a holy, burnt animal sacrifice. There was over 6 million Jews that were killed, and many were burnt in the furnaces, and their ashes were made roads out of. Hitler, through the demonic spirits, were using God's children to make burnt offerings at the altar of Zeus again. There was a lot of people that thought that Hitler was the Antichrist, and Hitler was not the Antichrist. Hitler is just a shadow of the Antichrist to come still. So if we think the evil in Hitler was bad, that is nothing yet. That was just a shadow of the Antichrist. That is not what is to come. And so I leave you with this, that in 1 John 2 and 18 it says, little children, is it the last time? See, the children right here were facing great persecution from the Roman government. Evil things were happening. And they thought that dementia right here was the Antichrist. And he was telling them, no, he ain't Antichrist. This ain't the last time. And he said, and this as that ye have heard, that the Antichrist shall come. Even now there are many Antichrists, whereby that we know that it is the last times. There has been many Antichrists, and there is still many Antichrists in the world right now. And these many Antichrists are ramping up for the Antichrist. And like I said, if we think that Hitler was evil, now we look at all of this evil that was done, and then we look back through history and we say, how could a whole country, a whole bunch of people like that accept the extermination, accept these cruel acts that was done in Germany? Because you can't tell me that a whole country, every one of them was just numb and cold-hearted and cold-blooded. You can't tell me that. But what they were done was they were mesmerized and they were spellbound. They were tricked. My Bible tells me that even the elite, if it be possible, will be deceived by the real Antichrist. I'm telling you, church, we're living in a day, in a time, in an hour that this world is starting to ramp up. It's news all over. I mean, it hit just, I don't watch the news. I'm not plugged into the news. And by goodness, by 1:30, I had already heard that the U.S., that Trump said that he would recognize and has recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which I agree with. Jerusalem has always belonged to Israel, and it will always belong to Israel. It should have 70 years ago in their Declaration of Freedom, in their declaration as a nation, should have been made the capital then. But for the sake of what they call peace in the Arab world and in the Muslim world, nobody would do it. But I'm going to tell you, by Trump making that statement, it is now turned every Muslim country upside down. They are now gearing up to have some of the biggest rallies and demonstrations against Israel that has ever been thought of. Every country is turning against Israel right now. Now, I don't know about you, but in my Bible, it tells me in the last days that every nation will turn against Israel. Now, we look at the nations as being like the United States, being Germany, being Europe, but the word nations there, when it is translated in, it's nekleisius, which is where we get our word for ethnics. So if you look at that, it says every ethical person will turn against Israel around them. And we see that every ethnicity is turning against Israel right now. Even the United States is split down the middle, and half of it is now turning against Israel. So you are split right now because when he made that declaration, the automatically half of the United States said, we're not with them. We don't believe in Israel. We should have never done that for Israel. So half of our country has already turned. So we think that this nation will not turn against Israel? Half of us has already done it in the last 5 hours. In the last 5 hours. There is evil being released in this world. I want to share something else with you because you want to know blood sacrifices are still going on to this day. Abortions are blood sacrifices. It's the killing of innocents. And Satan is amping up through demonic spirits these blood sacrifices. How do you think that these people go out and mass murder the person in Las Vegas? They still don't know why he done it. He went in there and murdered 50-something people, nearly 60 people, and they don't know why. Because demonic spirits demand blood sacrifices, and these demons get in people's head and drives them to do these things for the shedding of blood. I'm telling you, church, we are living in a day, in an era. We're living in a day, in an era where Satan is doing all that he can to destroy us. He's destroying lives by the groves. And somewhere, we have to realize, church, that it's time for us to get on board. Back in my sinful days, I have been a part of a lot of Satan's tools to help him. A lot of us has made bad choices or may have made bad choices in our lives that fed the demonic activity. Because you're either for God or you're not. But it's time, church, that we change everything that we do and we live all out. Because if we're on the fence in any way, any form, any shape, when it gets tough, we may not be able to make the right choices. You know, I started looking at this and I really started thinking about this. You know, how was Hitler able to do so much evil? How is there so much evil? Because we all know that we've been to India. Man, the Indian people are good people. They're good people. There's good people in Africa. There's good people in Nepal. There's good people in the Middle East. There's good people in Pakistan. There's good people in Turkey. There's good people all over the place. And there's Muslims that wouldn't hurt nobody. But then how do you get a whole movement of Muslims to do mass murder? And everybody else that is not agree to it. Through the sacrifices that are being made, it sends deaf, dumb, and blind spirits upon the people to where they do not see the actual evil that's being created around them. That's how come that Hitler was able to do so much. Because there was people in Germany that after they started showing the videos and the furnaces and all of the gas chambers that were appalled and sickened. That happened down the street from them that they had no idea. And people was like, how could you not know? It was because they were blinded. Church, I don't want to be someone that is blinded. Right? I want to know. And so, therefore, the study of Pergamos was a very dark place with demonic activity happening all around it that was acceptable for everybody to watch. And so, what I'm leaving us with is that we need to make sure that we're not one of the blind people that watches these things go on. It's time that we start standing up and saying, enough is enough.